good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the ITF special academic lecture series. My name is Kuehne Chen. I lead the Innovation and Policy Analytics unit at the Research Center of the ITF, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. This is our second lecture under the ITF special academic lecture series, and this new initiative aims to foster academic discussion and share knowledge on critical transport issues by bringing together experts from around the globe. A brief introduction about the ITF for the ones online who don't know very well about ITF. ITF is an intergovernmental organization with 69 member countries acting as a global think tank for transport policies. The ITF facilitates the exchange of insights and ideas to improve transport worldwide. So we are delighted to have you join this insightful session on enhancing freight transport decarbonization through analytical framework. Applications to Central and Southeast Asia. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Alan McKinnon. Professor Alan McKinnon is leading figure in logistics and freight transport sector. He holds master's degree from University of Aberdeen and the University of British Columbia and a PhD from the University of London. His academic career began in 1979 with significant roles at the University of Leicester and Heriot-Watt University, where he established the Research Center for Logistics. And since 2012, he has been at Kuehne Logistics University in Hamburg. McKinnon has conducted extensive research, advised international organizations like the European Commission, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the OECD and ITF, of course, and received notable awards, including the Sir Robert Lawrence Award. So his work spans sustainable logistics, freight transport policy, and environmental impacts. Today's topic, decarbonizing transport for freight sector, is particularly relevant in the dynamic regions of Central and Southeast Asia, where sustainable practices are essential for future growth for these regions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Alan McKinnon. Professor, please take the floor.
Thank you, Kuehne, for that introduction, and good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this presentation. Just to add to what Kuehne said, I'm one of three academics that have been working on what they call the SIPA project. This is a project that ITF is running on sustainable infrastructure program in Asia. A couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues, Ruth Banham-Yong, delivered his presentation on connectivity. Mine today is going to focus on the decarbonisation of freight transport, and there'll be one in a couple of weeks' time from Jasper Verschuur, which will look at resilience. So there is a paper which you can download and consult. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is give you a very brief introduction to the paper that I have written. If I just move to the outline of this presentation. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about the objectives of the study. As Kuehne mentioned, it's really based particularly in two Asian regions, Central Asia and also Southeast Asia. It's focused very much on policymakers to give them advice really on how they can adapt and refine their decarbonisation programs for freight transport. It also focuses on what I call the freight decarbonisation levers, the things that policymakers can do to help to cut carbon emissions in this area. But unusually, it's taking a life cycle perspective on the subject. It's not simply looking at emissions from the operations of vehicles. It's also looking at the embedded emissions in transport infrastructure. So I'll comment on that, and then I'll end with some concluding remarks. So the objectives of the work, one of the main objectives is to raise the profile of freight transport in the governments and the international organizations of Asia. The feeling is that currently freight transport doesn't get sufficient attention in these decarbonisation plans. A lot of the emphasis of this work has been on the development of conceptual and analytical frameworks to help policymakers to cut carbon emissions from this vital activity. And we're looking here really at four frameworks. First is what I call the macro logistics framework. As I'm sure many of the people on the call will realize, that for decades now, freight transport has been managed and planned within the context of logistics, seeing freight transport as an integral part of that process involving inventory management, warehousing, materials planning, materials handling, and IT and so forth. But much of that logistics work, certainly by academics, is focused on what we call micro-logistics, looking at how it relates to individual companies. What macro-logistics does is apply that similar logic at a governmental level or a national level. One of the main exponents of this has been South African professor Jan Havinga. I've extracted just one sentence here from much of his literature, and he describes this macro level perspective as involving the systemic calculation of all resource costs required for sustainable freight logistics configurations to enable trade-offs against other macroeconomic macro production factors. So that's where we're pitching the analysis at the level of countries and governments. Other conceptual frameworks in the study look at how a government could develop a freight decarbonisation strategy. It also looks at how one can assess the various options that are available for decarbonising freight transport. And then, as I mentioned a few moments ago, maybe a bit unusually, we're factoring into this assessment the emissions that are embedded in the transport infrastructure. Much of the work looks at the choice of metrics, the indicators that can be used to monitor and plan freight decarbonisation. And one other issue which I address in this report, I ask the question, for those emerging markets in Asian countries, do they necessarily have to follow the same logistics development pathway that we've seen in Europe and in North America, which has led these countries to fairly high carbon logistics? You know, is there an alternative pathway that these countries could follow, which would allow them to enjoy all the benefits of economic development, but without suffering the very high levels of carbon emissions from freight transport? And I'll return to that subject later on. Just to put this into a statistical context, really, for Asia, if one looks at the pie chart, you can see that the Asia-Pacific region actually is responsible for the biggest share of transport emissions, 31%. Almost a third of emissions are coming from this region. That's twice as many transport emissions as currently coming from Europe, for example. And also the research that's been done suggests that freight transport represents a bigger share of transport CO2 emissions in Asia than in other parts of the world. So globally, freight represents about 42% of transport emissions. In the Asian region, it's as much as 56%. And if we simply focus our attention on road transport, one can see, and this is based on research by the Asian Transport Outlook, that heavy-duty vehicles account for a significantly larger share of energy-related CO2 emissions than do light-duty vehicles, cars and vans. You would think then that, given the importance of freight in this region, that it would attract more policy attention. But that seems not to be happening. Again, if one looks at the excellent work that's been done over the years by Surya Gota and Kuehne Logistics for the Asian Transport Outlook, one thing they've observed is there's far more coverage of passenger transport related measures than freight transport measures in the areas of sustainability and decarbonisation. And there's even a report by the Council for Decarbonising Transport in Asian countries that describes freight transport as the neglected child of transport decarbonisation. So thankfully, that child has found a home in the report that I've written for ITF. So if one looks then at the framework that a government could apply to develop a strategy for decarbonising freight transport. Some years ago, I developed what I call my 10C approach, which was targeted very much at companies. So what I've done in this report is really reframed that 10C framework for governments and for policymakers. It's called 10C because it's 10 English words beginning with the letter C. And I'll just quickly rattle through them. The first C is commitment to decarbonize, because in the course of this SIPA project for ITF, a survey was done of government officials in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia, and it asked them to what extent they were factoring freight decarbonization into their freight planning and their transport infrastructure design. And the results of that were rather disappointing, suggesting that currently there isn't really sufficient commitment in government circles to decarbonize freight. Looking at the second C, which is calculating transport emissions, major strides in the calculation of freight transport emissions in the corporate sector, where we have got standard methodologies now from GLEC and ISO 14083, standardizing methodologies and reporting standards. We don't currently have that really at a governmental level. And the report, again, discusses what we can do to achieve that. Once you know the level of emissions from freight transport, the next thing then is to commit to targets. And again, at the corporate level, we've got the Science-Based Targeting Initiative, which is helping businesses coming up with realistic, credible targets for cutting emissions. Again, we don't have that degree of standardization at a governmental level. And again, the work that's been done within Asia has found very few examples of Asian countries setting targets for cutting their freight-related emissions. The fourth one is to consider all the policy options that you could deploy really to cut freight emissions, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. And in doing that, it's desirable for governments to collaborate in three respects. First of all, collaborating with other countries in the region, and that happens within the frameworks of ASEAN, for example, and UNSCAP and CAREC, really, for Central Asia. The second thing to do is for national governments to collaborate with subnational administrations, because they are the ones that often have more direct control over emissions within urban areas, for example. And the third type of collaboration is with other stakeholders, obviously with the private sector, to try to galvanize initiatives to cut freight emissions. Sixth C is to cost initiatives. And in the report, I strongly recommend the application of marginal abatement cost analysis, which is now quite a refined tool that can be used to test policy options. The only regret here is that governments that have attempted to do this and have discovered difficulty in finding enough data to calibrate the marginal abatement cost analysis. Once you've got the necessary data, the next thing for governments then to do is to choose appropriate policy measures. The Asian Transport Outlook work has constructed an inventory of the policymakers that appear in the documentation of governments in Asia. And there are many, many of these policy initiatives. This is one of the great things about freight decarbonisation. We're not looking for a silver bullet. There are a whole broad range of things, most of which are mutually reinforcing to help us to decarbonise freight transport. The 8C is carbon offsetting, which in a governmental context is a bit different from that, I think, of a company. As some of you may be aware, there's been a crisis really in voluntary carbon markets recently. Their credibility and integrity, I think, has been undermined. And I think there is now a role for governments maybe to put corporate carbon offsetting on a firmer regulatory footing. And that's something, again, which is discussed in the paper. Having got to the ninth stage, government is ready really to implement its freight decarbonisation strategy. And again, there's a discussion in the paper as to how that can be done. And then governments learn from that process, right? We then put in place a series of feedback loops. Governments can then, through time, recalibrate that strategy in the light of experience. Now, what I'd like to do is to single out one of the 10 Cs, the considering policy option 1, just to look at the various things that governments can do to cut emissions. Now, again, those of you who've worked in this area will know there's much discussion of the ASI framework. There's also the ASIF framework, looking 3 categories of initiatives or 4 categories of initiatives. The one I prefer is the 5-category initiative, where we look at ways of reducing the demand, or at least moderating the growth in demand for freight transport. Second is to improve freight modal shift. The third is to improve the capacity utilization of the vehicles that we use in the freight sector. The fourth, which is energy efficiency, improve the energy efficiency of the vehicles. And then the fifth is to cut the carbon content of the energy that we use in freight transport. And everything we can do falls into one of those 4 categories. Now, just elaborating a little bit on these ones, again, they're discussed in much more detail in the report. As far as reducing the demand for freight transport, not a very popular option with governments, particularly in emerging markets, because of the historical close coupling of economic and freight traffic growth. There's obviously a reluctance to risk jeopardizing economic prospects to cut freight traffic. However, it is worth noting that between 2010 and 2020, there was actually a decoupling of the GDP and freight ton kilometer trends in Asian countries. And that wasn't the result of a deliberate policy. That's happened more naturally. But there are things that governments can do to influence this particular lever, altering what I call the spatial dynamics and the macro logistics of economic development in their countries. Now, I'll come back in a moment and say a bit more about freight transport, but moving on at this point just to talk about vehicle utilization. There's unfortunately a chronic lack of data, not just in Asia, but around the world, on the utilization of freight vehicles, and not just road vehicles, locomotives, aircraft, ships as well. And it always seems to me that has been constraining policy initiatives in this area. In Asian countries too, we've got a double problem with utilization. It's not just that many vehicles are underloaded; many of them are also overloaded, which can be as problematic in carbon terms as underloading. However, on a more positive note, there are a whole range of things that can be done to improve the load factors of vehicles, particularly digitalization, supply chain collaboration between businesses to share their assets, and also possibly relaxation of the weights and dimensions of freight vehicles. And again, things are briefly discussed in the report. On energy efficiency, the main policy prescriptions here are the ones you can see: fuel economy standards, particularly for new vehicles, phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. In 2021, I think about $36 billion were spent subsidizing fossil fuel in Asian countries. And this obviously makes it harder to incentivize freight users to use their vehicles more energy efficiently. But there are also a whole range of other sort of macroeconomic measures that can be used, plus some more targeted policies focused on the vehicles, the freight vehicles, the way they're being driven, and also the logistical operations and how they can be applied in a way that will help us to reduce energy consumption in this area. And then if we move to freight transport, one thing that's worth noting, if you look at the graph on the right there, showing the average modal split for Asian countries, that it's water transport that is waterborne transport, which is the main low carbon alternative to road across Asian countries. Unlike in Europe, for example, where we tend to think of this binary distinction between road and rail, waterborne transport is important. Nevertheless, significant amounts of freight are moved by rail. The rail share of freight markets across Asian countries varies enormously. Very low in countries like Vietnam and Thailand, as you can see, very high in a Central Asian state like Kazakhstan. Very few Asian countries currently set freight modal split targets. And I think there's a need really for them to give more attention to that. also to recognize the problems that countries everywhere in the world have really in trying to get more freight onto rail and water. There are a whole range of tools that policymakers can apply. Studies in Europe and also in Asia have shown the range of initiatives that can be applied to get more freight onto rail and water. But the key thing is that you have to customize this. You really have to tailor those modal shift policies to the needs and circumstances of the country. One other important thing is to recognize the impact that the defossilization of the Asian economy is going to have on the opportunities for shifting freight to these alternative modes, because fossil fuel has been a core traffic, particularly of the railways, but also of inland waterways. And depriving these modes of that traffic, I think, is going to be make it harder to get more freight onto these modes. Because of that, we're going to have to see a change in the commodity mix that's handled by these vehicles, by these modes. And I think for that purpose, it will be desirable to rethink the metrics that we currently use to measure freight modal split. We tend to use just freight ton kilometers, but as we move to lower density, higher manufactured goods being moved by these modes, I'm not sure the ton kilometer is the most appropriate indicator. And the other thing is we have to improve the quality and accuracy of the emission factor data that we use for freight transport, because it's the gap in those emission factors which currently underpins government policy really on freight modal shift. But what happens a lot is that these emission factors are extrapolated from one country to another, or we tend to use historic emission factor data for these freight transport modes, and that doesn't take account of current trends in the relative carbon efficiency of these transport modes. So there's, I think, a need for a lot more work in this area. The other decarbonisation lever that I would like to slightly elaborate upon is that of reducing the carbon content of the energy that we use in freight transport. Now, Central Asia and Southeast Asia are currently at a very early stage in that freight energy transition, as you can see in the graph on the right. I think currently only about 3 or 4% of biofuel is currently used in transport in general in Asia, not just in freight. There are widely differing rates at which freight energy decarbonisation is likely to occur across Asia, partly because of the natural resource endowment. Clearly in Central Asia, some Southeast Asian countries, again, there are fossil fuel reserves that countries want to use. The potential for producing biomass for biofuels, again, varies a lot between these countries, and therefore it won't be a one-size-fits-all. We will have to see different energy decarbonisation strategies across these countries. One other thing worth noting is that several of the big economies of Asia currently have a relatively high carbon intensity of electricity. You can see from that graph how the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour for electricity is significantly above the global average, the green line in countries like Kazakhstan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth. So again, there'll be a need for these countries to accelerate that decarbonisation. I need also for them to improve the electrical connectivity that will be required for the electrification of freight transport in these countries. Significant potential too for increasing the electrification of rail networks across Asia. It's currently at about 54% of the Asian rail network is electrified. Okay, that's way above what you would find in North America or South America, but there's still potential there for increasing that level of electrification. And the other thing is, these Asian countries that we've looked at are currently at a very early stage in making this transformation of freight fleets from fossil fuel to renewable energy. As part of the SIPA project, again, surveys were done of government officials in Central Asian countries and also Southeast Asian countries. And one thing they were asked is what decarbonisation policies they're currently factoring into their freight transport strategies. And you can see on that graph some of the summary results. The numbers there relate to the the 5 decarbonisation levers. There's quite a difference, as you can see, between Central Asia and Southeast Asia. So in the case of Southeast Asia, the things that are being prioritised are things like the overloading of vehicles and the yeah, I'm trying to think what the other ones are. Whereas in Central Asia, there's a lot more interest in rail electrification, for example. But this is giving us an insight really into the current state of play in these countries. Another thing which the report does is look at the metrics that can be used to measure the impact of these 5 decarbonisation levers. I don't have time here to go through and explain all of these metrics, but these are the ones that we think would give policymakers sufficient insight really into understanding how the freight decarbonisation process is progressing. And then moving towards the end of the short presentation, I mentioned that part of the project has involved looking at the way in which we can integrate transport emissions, transport infrastructure emissions into the assessment of freight transport decarbonisation. And that work really breaks down into 4 parts. The first part looks at where we draw emission boundaries around infrastructure-related emissions and how they can be classified with respect to the life cycle of the asset. Again, it reviews the literature. There's a wonderful paper published in 2022 on this subject that looks at over the life of an infrastructural asset, where are the carbon emissions emerging. The section also looks at what can be done to try to decarbonize the construction and maintenance of transport infrastructure used by freight vehicles. Third thing is to look at what methodologies we could use to combine infrastructure-related emissions with the operational emissions that we get from the vehicle, so that we can create some sort of unified life cycle assessment for freight emissions, which involves obviously looking at how you split those emissions between freight vehicles and passenger vehicles, but also between different types of freight traffic that would be carried on a piece of infrastructure. And just to give an example, just a sort of ballpark figure using some average data. Let's suppose you have a highway which has got embedded emissions of about 1,000 tons of CO2 per kilometre over a 40-year service life. Let's suppose that trucks represent about 1/3 of the traffic using that road. Imagine you've got 1,000 trucks a day, and the average carbon intensity of moving trucks on that road, about 23 grams of CO2 per truck kilometre. If you factor all that together and then combine it with the operational data, it would suggest that your infrastructure emissions would represent about 1.4% of the total emissions. Okay, so infrastructure doesn't necessarily represent a big proportion, but in some areas, depending on the nature of the road and the level of utilization, the percentage could be higher than that. But I present this simply as an average sort of ballpark figure. And then the fourth issue that we look at in the paper is asking to what extent the inclusion of these infrastructure-related emissions how that might impact on the freight decarbonisation policy-making process. And just to give one example, one area of freight transport policy-making that might be affected would be freight modal shift. Because if to expand the use of rail, for example, you have to invest very heavily in additional rail capacity, that will come with quite a heavy carbon penalty. If one looks at some work done by the International Union of Railways, UIC, in 2016, they reckon that the carbon payback period for investment in a dedicated freight rail line would be about 12 years. They then use what they call their eco-calculation tools to see what effect calculating these infrastructure-related emissions would have on what they call the carbon competitiveness of the rail freight sector. And the conclusion they come to is that it would not have all that significant an impact. But that's a fairly sweeping result, which I think probably needs some additional investigation. And then finally, I mentioned right at the start that one issue which is addressed in the paper is this question of whether emerging markets in Asia could follow an alternative logistics development pathway, which would lead to a lower carbon outcome. So this is a diagram which appears in the report. I've used it elsewhere in the past. So what it does is try to map the relationship between economic development in a country and the increase in carbon emissions from freight transport. I don't have time to discuss this in detail, but what it suggests is, again, if you look at how economies have developed in the current developed world of Europe and North America, what you find is there's road-biased infrastructure improvement. There's certain types of industrial development. There is a move to the centralization of inventory, wider sourcing of supplies, just in time, changes in the commodity mix, a whole suite of things that happen and seem to be integral to the process of economic development, which tends to result in freight transport becoming much more carbon intensive. So the question I simply ask is it possible to deviate from that pathway? Or the alternative might be that if it's not possible to deviate, maybe there are mitigation measures that can be introduced to try to restrain the growth in freight transport emissions. And I tend to come to that alternative explanation. It seems to me the economic development benefits, the economic benefits of following the conventional economic development pathway for logistics are so great in terms of the economies you get from centralizing inventory and economies of scale and tightly coupling processes. It's unlikely a country would follow an alternative pathway, but what they can do is introduce a series of mitigation measures. The ones I've represented in the blue boxes here, things like, exploiting intermodality, going for a more balanced process of infrastructure development, making more effective use of land use planning, for example, strongly promoting digitalization. That these things can be, if they're effectively deployed, then that can help us to enjoy all the benefits of economic growth without suffering all the disbenefits of having a highly carbon-intensive freight transport system. So I've taken a bit longer than I expected, but I hope you found that of interest. There are my contact details and those of the team working on the SIPA project within ITF, and hopefully there's some time, Kuehne, for some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor McKinnon. So please feel free to stop sharing your screen. We have already a few questions already lined up. But before that, I'd like to thank you again, Professor McKinnon, for your time and expertise in sharing this lecture with us. And we continue to encourage our audience to use the Q&A function. So we have already a few questions that I'll start by the first one from David. And Professor, David mentioned that we do a lot of work already in decarbonization of our freight logistics in South Africa, but their grid emission factor is very significant, with about 1.013 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, resulting in their electric rail being more emission intensive than their diesel rail services. And so he's wondering whether you could comment on this and whether there are any strategies of combating that.
Yeah, well, this takes us beyond the reach of freight transport policy. I mean, the thing obviously to try to do is to decarbonize the electricity supply. That doesn't just apply to South Africa. I mean, as I've shown, there are many countries in Asia which also have electricity carbon intensity way beyond the global average. Yeah, I mean, there are other things you can do to decarbonize rail, moving away from. Well, it depends. If you have to get access to the electricity at source, that's not going to help you moving to battery locomotives or hydrogen fuel cells, because you're still relying on the basic electricity to decarbonize your rail operation. You could make some use of biofuel in rail. It doesn't happen very much, but it is an alternative way of decarbonizing this area. But Yeah, I'm well aware of the electricity situation in South Africa. I've been going there in recent years to Stellenbosch University, so it is a bit of a problem. But I think that the problem resides really in the energy sector rather than what we can do in the freight transport sector.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor. Our next question is related to infrastructure emissions. So from Henrik mentioned that in some countries, construction releases significant additional emission through interventions in land, wetland, peatland, etc. So
Yep.
he's wondering if that could be the case in some Asian countries too.
Yes, it is. I mean, across Asia, you've got such a variety of geographies. And so the construction emissions from building roads and railways varies a lot simply because of the topography. And then you overlay that with the different construction techniques that you can use, the different materials. One factor that again influences the carbon intensity of a new stretch of road or railway is where you're sourcing the materials you require. I mean, if they're available locally, again, that can help you to reduce the amount of material movement that's required. So yeah, that's an issue. It makes it very hard to generalize. I mean, I was a bit embarrassed. I mean, showing my ballpark calculation there, which doesn't specifically relate to Asia, but it just illustrates, how we can combine the operational emissions from freight transport with those embedded in the infrastructure. So yeah, you're entirely right. It's the conditions vary so much, and also the design of the infrastructure varies. Another factor which strongly influences the embedded emissions is the extent to which you rely on tunneling or cuttings and creating embankments and so forth. These things again, and again, that is a factor of the geography. So if you've got a flat country, solid land, little water, you can obviously produce a bit of infrastructure with a lower carbon intensity than if it's a mountainous area or one which has drainage problems and so forth. So you've touched on an important issue, and it's certainly one which I address in the report. But there is out there a huge literature, really, on how we carbon footprint transport infrastructure.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers Henrik's question, Henrik. So the third question I have from the audience is Hazim would like to comment on the difficulties to promote the local logistics companies to utilize rail freight. So he would like to know more of this strategies and other strategies to promote people to further utilize the railway freight, for example, carbon payback or other strategies that you may consider useful.
Yeah, okay. A lot of work has been done by governments, by academics, looking at all the ways in which we can get more freight onto the railways. There was also a very good ITF report published, I think 2 or 3 years ago, looking at all the problems of getting more freight onto the railways, taking a broader historical perspective on this. It depends on a whole range of factors. Depends which country you're in. If it's a very small country, the railways can't take advantage of their long haul advantage, and so it can be a real struggle getting. It depends on the density of the rail network. Depends on the extent to which you have to rely on intermodality to get freight onto rail, as opposed to having sort of siding to siding type operations. It's a difficult factor. If we take a public policy perspective on this, again, it's been argued for many years that we need to try to create some sort of level playing field. So if we took account of the level of externality from rail as opposed to road or other freight modes, that if we somehow internalize more of the environmental costs of these modes, that would create a more level playing field for the railways and make it easier for them to capture freight. But it's a big subject. It's very hard to answer your question comprehensively in the time available. But And yeah, I mean, it depends the extent to which policymakers do the work to get more freight onto rail. Obviously, the rail companies themselves have to market themselves effectively, and often they have to improve the standard of service to make the operation commercially attractive, leaving aside the carbon benefits. Although more and more companies these days are trying to decarbonize their supply chains, and they see switching modes to lower carbon transport modes as an effective way of doing that, right? So that this, I think, is going to work to the advantage of the railways if they're commercially competitive enough to capture that advantage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. And as Professor McKinnon mentioned, ITF has done similar studies on this topic as well. And our publications are freely to be downloaded on our website. So please explore such topic as well on the ITF website. And the last question from the audience before I reserved one for myself is the question about urban consolidation centers. So from Kuehne. So Kuehne wanted to know that whether urban consolidation centers are really a means to achieve decarbonization, as it has already been found in some success in the UK. So.
Yes, again, a big subject that would take me a long time to discuss properly. I mean, I'm an old guy. You mentioned I started way back in 1979. So, I mean, I did work on urban freight consolidation centres way back in the 1990s, most of it based here in the UK. I mean, theoretically, it should make sense to locate a urban consolidation centre on the outskirts of town, where you consolidate loads and then you minimize vehicle kilometers, energy use, and emissions on the route in from the periphery to shops and businesses in the city centre. And again, there have been loads of trials over the years, and it has been shown to work. The trouble is making it work commercially and ensuring that it survives. It's got some duration, because there are lots of these trials that never survive beyond the ending of the trial period, where there was subsidy involved. There are nevertheless some viable urban consolidation centres in existence here in the UK, in the Netherlands, and other countries, so it can be made to work. What is maybe more interesting these days is micro consolidation centers, because as we've been transforming the urban logistics systems in many countries, as we move to e-commerce, that the companies that are doing online last mile deliveries realize there's a need for small consolidation centers well within the urban area to help them consolidate loads, and also to move to alternative modes, so to cargo cycles, for example, away from vans, so that we've had, in a sense, to reinvent a lot of our earlier thinking on urban freight consolidation centers, to see how their role may need to be adapted to this new online retail world that we have created. But again, as an academic, I can say if you're interested in this whole area of urban freight consolidation centers, there is an enormous literature out there on the subject. And I say lots of actual trials to see, what its long-term viability might be. So, yeah, hopefully that was of some interest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. While I'm trying to ask my question, I see the last question popped in. So in the interest of time, I'm going to reserve my question in another coffee chat or something with you, Professor Alan. Right. I will give this chance to the audience. So Asim is commenting that thanks a lot for your presentation, Professor Alan. Much of the transformation that is sought is dependent on change in mindsets and behavior. So are there any significant differences between the Asian regions and other parts of the world that necessitates a new unified theory of change?
Wow, that's a good question, and it's one that I'm just not really able to answer. In my paper, I don't really get into the behavioral aspects of transport policy making or of corporate behavior. I imagine there will be a cultural and behavioral dimension to this work, but it's not something I've personally investigated. One point I will make, however, is that a lot of logistical activity across Asian countries is performed by multinational companies, right, that are essentially global businesses, that many of which have tried to standardize the way management culture across the business. But again, that's not to deny that for the indigenous businesses in these countries, again, they will have particular ways of conducting business, which may then impact upon the strategies they use to decarbonize their logistics. So it's a great point, and I'm outside my comfort zone on this one, so I won't really comment too much on that subject.
Thank you very much, Professor. So as much as I would like to explore, more further with Professor, I think we are running out of time. So thank you very much, Professor McKinnon, again for your insightful presentation and responses to the audience. So on behalf of the ITF, I extend our gratitude to Professor McKinnon for his time and expertise. I also would like to thank our audience for their participation and proposing these interesting questions for discussion. So before we conclude, I'm very pleased to also announce our next lecture. As Professor McKinnon already mentioned in the beginning, that there will be another lecture series on enhancing freight transport resilience through analytical framework by Professor Jasper Verschoor from TU Delft on the 23rd of July at the same time. So the registration link has already been popped up into the chat box. So please, we encourage you to join us again and provide your feedback and suggestion on the future topics. Thank you to all the organizers and our technical team for making this event smooth. So we hope you found today's lecture enriching, and have a great day or have a great evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much again, Professor McKinnon.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.